What if Deku kept One for All? Now, with how the story went, of course, he couldn't. But picture a scenario where he ends up keeping that quirk, and all the other quirks alongside it. He's victorious over Shigaraki, but doesn't lose One for All. How strong could he possibly get? We'll have to treat this video like half what if, half power scaling video. Part of it is up to how Deku would carry himself over the next few years, and what would change with him having One for All still. But we'll also need to establish where he started out at, by figuring out how strong he was at the end of the War Arc. Then we can go from there. In the War Arc, we see Deku at his peak, and it's also the last time we see him using One for All, so we'll take that. Everything in My Hero Academia for feats is fair game here. The movies could actually help us out too. Now, the main things we'll want to scale off of are characters like Shigaraki, All Might, and even some of the movie villains like Nine and Dark Might. But particularly the first two are the most important ones. First off, All Might. Deku has surpassed Prime All Might by this point in the story, so what is All Might capable of in his prime? Well, he doesn't really have a ton of feats. We know he was considered the pinnacle of strength, and he gave Prime All for One a run for his money, and even while he was severely weakened, he basically punched his entire head off. Speaking of a weakened All Might, we can mostly scale him off of what his weakened state is like, particularly from the feats we actually do see. For one, he made a statement in the USJ arc stating that he took over 300 punches to defeat the Nomu, and in his prime it would have taken 5. So people often point to this and say that Prime All Might is exactly 60 times stronger than this version of him. Now I think that's a bit dubious. You could argue that All Might's just estimating, and he's not being literal and exact here. It could easily be a rough estimate, but it's probably within the ballpark of what he could do. Like, he also does have no reason to lie here, and he knows his strength the best. So let's assume it's exactly right. Any All Might feat is 1/60th of what he could do in his prime. Without going too far into his feats in the main story here, that would mean we could easily push him into like Continental tier. It's based on simply just multiplying his current feats, or scaling him beyond other people like Star and Stripe, who pull off country level feats but can't reach All Might's prime. Cross-referencing it with stuff like that makes it sound more solid when we place him in that tier. It's also further supported by something Deku says in the War Arc. He says his final smash here is only a bit stronger than what the 8th One for All user could pull off, that being All Might. Deku was weakened in this moment too, by the way. We'll get to that later on, and how that feat actually scales too. But let's go over to Shigaraki. He also surpassed All Might and was defeated by Deku. After his surgery, he stated to be on par with Prime All Might, and in the War Arc, we see him go all out. He's even stronger because he has various strength-enhancing quirks and all the other nonsense that All for One gave him, placing him beyond All Might. He's definitely beyond Continental, probably brushing up upon multi-continental tier when you consider his whole bag of quirks. He's also easily relativistic based on his fight with Star and Stripe, which is kind of funny because the way you scale him here is a bit circular. He has radio waves as an attack. He launched them at Star and Stripe, she dodged them, and those waves would move around the speed of light, so that would make her relativistic by dodging them, and he outspeeds her. And in the War Arc, he's even faster, so I typically place him around speed of light, maybe a little beyond. And now we could just do a simple scaling chain. When Deku is holding nothing back, using his actual full power, he is able to greatly exceed Shigaraki, and then Shigaraki's beyond Prime All Might. And Prime All Might is 60 times stronger than weakened All Might, so this basically just adds another tier to Deku's power. Deku also has an attack power feat of his own. It's not just based off of chain scaling. He changed the weather in the United States all the way from Japan, and affected the global weather entirely, which is a multi-continental feat in power. And remember, he did this while he was already weakened. And in case you're not convinced that he's already notably beyond All Might, the nature of One for All is that it gets stronger every time it's passed down, and logically Deku's 100% would be above Prime All Might's 100% at this point. By default, essentially. Plus, it's shown multiple times that the quirk was already at a point where it's getting too strong. So this is all a very long way of saying Deku is consistently going to be a multi-continental character, but he can be pushed even further. If you want to really highball him, we could actually go all the way back to Heroes Rising. This is a funny one that my friend pointed out to me, and I never actually considered this one, but again, I'm calling it a highball for a reason because it requires a lot of assumptions. There's a scene where 9 pictures creating a massive storm that covers a huge chunk of Earth. The reason I even mention this and say it's a highball is because it's not something 9 ever did. However, if we give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that this is something he can eventually do, that's where things get interesting. Thank you to Shigaraki Shimura for this calc. The energy required to create a storm of this size at the speed that he does requires an amount of energy that would push him to moon level. It did take 100% Deku and Bakugo plus Bakugo's explosion quirk to defeat 9 after all, and in the War Arc, Deku is reasonably beyond that feat in terms of strength, so at the very high end, assuming this tracks, you could push Deku to moon level. It's actually not too inconsistent with him being multi-continental, especially because what feats we see from Deku are not his limit. As I already stressed before, that final smash scene was a feat done by weakened Deku. And we know that Deku usually uses around 45% of One for All. Fajin combined with Gear Shift makes for a false 120% when using Overdrive. We don't know an actual multiplier for One for All, but assuming the percentages of it are linear, we could do some math. It would mean Overdrive gives a 2.67 times boost. This means that, at 100% One for All, If he used Overdrive, he'd be more like 267% of that power. And cranking One For All up to 100% is a 2.22 times boost beyond 45%. So basically at Deku's peak, he's using One For All 100% and Overdrive together. To calculate Deku's 100%, you would just take whatever feats he did at 45% and multiply them by 2.22. Then if you want to calculate how strong he'd be with Overdrive, we multiply that by 2.67, so potentially he can make attacks that are 5.927 times beyond any of his 45% feats. So his regular 45% is going to be stronger than the final smash he did with the Embers. Then you push that even further. But this is where we move on to the theorizing part of this. Deku is anywhere between multi-continental and moon level at his peak. I'm talking 100% One For All combined with Overdrive. So where would he go from here if he kept the quirk? A scenario where the strength of One For All doesn't reach a tipping point, and its insane stockpiled power is still kept and used by Deku. Well, as Deku continues his journey towards being a pro hero, he continues school, hero work, and training, meaning he's definitely going to be getting better control of all of his quirks. It won't happen overnight, but consider how fast Deku grew in the story. Despite constant stress and breaking his body, he grew and adapted rapidly. The story takes place in a time frame of just over 2 years. When Deku first got his quirk, he was still a nobody, but he went from that to being the strongest person in his verse's history within that time frame. All of his quirks will be growing. Not just the power of One For All, but every other quirk that he's already used. He'll adapt more with them. He'll find more creative ways to use them, etc. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to drop a like and some hype points on the video because that really does help out and it shows me you want to see more videos like this. And if you do want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to see whenever I upload them. Thank you all for supporting the channel too. And a big thing people might miss is that end of series Deku is not a fully matured One For All user. He's strong, but he's still young. He still has a lot of room to grow. And he only recently unlocked the full kit of his powers. Plus, every One For All user gets stronger over time, not just because of training, but because of One For All's function. All Might didn't peak in high school, he peaked many years later. Also, with any quirk, it's described as being like training a muscle, so you can make those quirks stronger by training them. And knowing Deku's work ethic, he can and will grow stronger. Even as a conservative assumption, let's say One For All's power increases by like 2 to 3 times. 2 to 3 times over the next few years into his adulthood. Particularly, let's take the very end of the story with that time skip where we see an adult Deku as a pro hero, just quirkless. Between the War Arc and at this point in the story, there's about an 8-year time skip, so this will be Deku with 8 years worth of extra training. He's going to be well beyond his War Arc self, even before Overdrive enters the equation. Plus, he definitely has effective use of 100% One For All by now. So, let's assume that the final smash from Deku was actually his 100% and scale from that. While he doesn't consistently use 100% during that fight, it's pretty reasonable to assume that in the final moment, he was using it and not holding back, even though his output was weakened. That previous 5.927 times multiplier will apply to any other feat he has, assuming he was using 45% in those moments. So with that 2 to 3 times growth, and then stacking Overdrive's multiplier on that multi-continental feat of his becomes more like a moon level attack when using 100% with Overdrive. And if we use the moon level highball from before as the baseline, then that makes him small planetary at the high end. Of course, he wouldn't constantly be putting out this output, but this is when he's using 100% with Overdrive. And remember, that's still pretty conservative growth for him too. Now, just because he grew a lot in his first 2 years, doesn't mean he's going to maintain that level of growth forever. It's definitely not infinite, and it's likely going to be diminishing at some point. And he'd eventually reach a plateau, but we're trying to find out what that level is. Where would he plateau or peak at? Well, let's also look at all of his quirks because, besides raw power, his abilities will develop too. All of his quirks can develop and potentially even awaken. Now, this will be more theory-driven because, first of all, quirk awakenings are very uncommon, and Deku has 6 or 7 quirks to focus on. One For All, of course, being the main focus, and the other 6 needing their own care. And in the event that any of these quirks awaken, all we could do is just make headcanons for what they would be like. So let's start with Gear Shift. At the very least, he's going to have more focus on his breathing and his oxygen control. Reducing the strain from Gear Shift, adapting to the lack of oxygen, getting some support item that helps alleviate it, etc. He has a lot of ways to dampen the negative effects. Not fully eliminate them, but adapt to them at the very least. If Gear Shift awakens, it'll be busted no matter what effect it has. I could see it potentially being something like rewinding motion, stopping motion, or applying inertia to objects without even touching them. For Black Whip, it's clearly one of Deku's favorite quirks to use based on how often he uses it and how much fun he has with it. He's already pretty adapted with it, and I can't see how much more he can improve it since he's already amazing with it. If it ever does awaken though, I imagine he'd be able to change its state more freely, like it could be soft, rigid, constricting, etc. More nuanced control for more variety in what he does. It could be a gentle lasso for saving, or a tight restraint for holding villains. Either way, some level of better control for it. Or even something stronger than Black Whip or Black Chain. Also, he'd have better use of overlay for strength enhancement and reinforcement. Even without a quirk awakening, he'd at least have that, and I'm sure he'll make better use of overlay. Danger Sense disappeared before Deku lost One For All thanks to Shigaraki stealing it. So even in a scenario where somehow Deku is able to defeat Shigaraki and keep One For All, he didn't have Danger Sense anymore. But if the fight went differently enough to where he keeps the quirk anyways, let's theorize if he did have it. It's worth at least considering what would happen if he kept it. Smokescreen and Danger Sense give him a ton of utility. Besides finding more ways to utilize Smokescreen, these quirks won't change much unless they fully awaken. Smokescreen is tough for thinking of an awakening for. Maybe it can create denser smoke, or one that can conceal everything about him, like sound, scent, any of his movements, etc., just for better stealth. Danger Sense would likely increase his precognition to new levels. Maybe it'll be applicable to smaller levels to predict movements, giving a bootleg Ultra Instinct maybe? Or maybe it'll just let him have more acute warnings and reactions. Deku's already pretty good with float, and if it did awaken, it would probably be some sort of actual flight. He already basically has a flight by combining powers, but this seems like the most reasonable awakening. For Fajin, I'm sure Deku would find ways to more quickly or passively build up energy, and just get huge reserves over time that he could store for longer. If it ever awakened, it could be something like being able to apply the stored energy to himself for reinforcement, or maybe just easier energy collection and storage in general. Like, more of what he does will passively build up that energy. For example, any small movements, walking, his heartbeat even, blood pumping through his body, that passively builds up the energy for him. But what about the biggest quirk of all? One For All. Could that awaken? Honestly, I think the argument that it already has awakened makes sense. Accessing the stockpiled quirks and not just the stockpiled power sounds like a very huge boost already, but personally I don't view that as a quirk awakening, and it might have its own potential for an individual awakening. Though, considering the past users of it didn't have some sort of insane awakening, even despite the constant stress and battles they faced, I don't know how likely this would even be. But let's say One For All eventually does get an individual awakening. What would it be? I think it would be fitting to have the power shared amongst others without losing it, kinda like he did with Bakugo against 9. Considering it happened there, it's not even really that unrealistic. Imagine if Deku could temporarily buff his allies, without actually passing One For All onto them and losing it. Or, if you really want to be overpowered, a quirk exchange where he could temporarily use the power of others as well, while they act as temporary vestiges. For example, he shares it for a bit with Bakugo, and he could use Bakugo's explosion quirk, a good version of All For One when you think about it. Hell, if All Might isn't feeling completely worn out, he could even briefly use this power again by using this quirk awakening. I feel like Deku would also have an appearance that reflects his power. He's always wanted to emulate All Might, and he would 100% do that here to some extent, though he's going to have more of his own identity, which he's already developed through the series anyways. At the very least, he'd always have a smile on his face, and given the training and growth he had, he'd probably have a similar build to All Might when using his full power. Again, the quirk awakenings are all hypothetical because of how rare and tough it is to get a quirk awakening. Especially with how strong Deku is already, I don't think he'd encounter a stressful enough situation to even warrant one of his quirks awakening, but even if he doesn't awaken any of the quirks, he's still improving them greatly. Just by using them more and training them like a muscle, he's going to get better. But even if a single quirk awakens, it's a huge buff since he uses all of his quirks in tandem. One quirk improving will help the others. Like, imagine if he buffs one of the quirks related to Overdrive, and then his Overdrive buff increases, and it gets easier to use and has more utility. A single awakening buffs everything. Besides his power, I still feel Deku would also teach at UA. I just think his pro hero career would start earlier on, since he wouldn't need to wait for a suit. He'd hit the ground running after graduation. Deku's already a number 4 hero with just a suit and no quirk, so it's pretty clear that if he kept his quirk, he'd be a solid number 1. He'd be the ultimate hero, and he's already considered the greatest hero as is. The story starts off calling him that, but this just cements it even further. As a high schooler, he achieved highs even higher than All Might, and that wasn't even his full potential. Not even close. Of course, he never reaches the ceiling in canon. This is what Deku might look like if his quirk was allowed to fully mature. Either way, it paints a pretty impressive picture. But let me know what you think below. How strong do you think he'd be? What other types of growth would he see, and what abilities would he have? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. You know, I don't know how much of this really matters because Deku having all these quirks means he's probably going to die earlier anyways, so he'll be the greatest hero ever, but he's dead at like 35. Oh well.